A few months ago, I made a video called Do Christians Want Tolerance or Dominance?, which discussed how evangelicals reacted to the gay wedding in an episode of Arthur. Of course, the short answer is they didn't take it well. Oops, sorry for the spoiler. But I used the opportunity to flesh out recent changes in the language Christians use when they take a public stand against things like gay marriage. Essentially, as societies become more pluralistic and tolerance has become more widely seen as a virtue, many of them have started recognizing that to publicly advocate for their positions, at least with any level of credibility, they'll need to speak the language of tolerance themselves. So I've noticed a trend of them rebranding their posture as a defensive stance, less coming at homosexuals with an overt demand to change how they live and who they love, and more just asking the world to show tolerance for their personal religious beliefs, which just happen to include the teaching that homosexuality is a sin. For example, when Kim Davis or a Christian baker doesn't want to assist homosexual couples, they shift the conversation from one of whether gays should have the right to receive services to one of whether Christians should have to violate their convictions by being forced to offer those services. And when laws are proposed to protect the LGBTQ community from discrimination, they gloss over the broad question of whether they should receive such protection and instead focus on hyped-up slippery slope fears that these laws will lead to churches or private Christian individuals being coerced into acting against their principles. Now, I don't want to tackle these legal issues at length. Along with the fact that these specific laws vary case by case, the Christian response to them usually involves straightforward fear-mongering tactics. And the argument about refusing services is so easily destroyed by counterexamples, for example, what if a Muslim clerk didn't want to serve Christians or women, that there's not a ton to unpack. What I want to get at instead is the mindset that lies beneath and supports these strategies, which is a general call to tolerance for anti-homosexual beliefs. It goes something like this. If it's important to tolerate varying forms of sexuality, including both homosexuality and heterosexuality, then should it not be equally important to tolerate varying perspectives on sexuality, including the belief that homosexuality is okay and that it's wrong? True inclusivity must include diverging opinions as well as orientations or lifestyles. So while liberals may think they're being tolerant by bringing homosexuality into their circle of inclusion, their demand that everybody tolerate all sexual orientations is actually by its very nature exclusive, leaving conservative Christians, indeed anybody who doesn't share their narrow little leftist opinion, outside the circle, showing that these progressives are actually as intolerant as anybody else in their own way. The idea can appear profound on the surface, exposing the short-sightedness of the liberal call to accept the LGBTQ community and revealing a huge, messy, crisscrossing web of often conflicting beliefs and lifestyles that must be accounted for in any real concept of tolerance. Even if it doesn't compel us to accept Christian doctrine, it shows that tolerance is more complicated and paradoxical than some people realize, and we should acknowledge that anti-homosexual Christians need to be allowed to operate in society according to their convictions. And if someone approaches you with a respectfully articulated love the sinner, hate the sin opinion that homosexuality is wrong, maybe they just want to be treated with the same level of respect and the same place in the conversation that a member of the LGBTQ community wants. This strategy of taking a demand about how others behave and rebranding it as part of their identity that they just want tolerated is one of the most insidiously clever yet under-addressed rhetorical moves made by modern evangelicals. It provides a reasonable-looking public face for their understated yet aggressive socio-political agenda, allowing them to run a full-scale blitzkrieg across the ideological landscape while pretending that anybody who pushes back or even shields themselves from the onslaught is attacking their right to hold convictions that fall in line with their faith. But logically, where does it go wrong? That's the trick, right? See, while this is presented as a fairer and more nuanced take on tolerance, it actually relies on a single pretty obvious simplification, which is that it treats all perspectives as equally valid and deserving of equal consideration. Misunderstanding and perhaps parodying liberalism, it views tolerance as an act of grouping any and all sets of ideas into categories and trying to accept as many categories as you can without evaluating them. And the more you accept, the more tolerant you are. This gross simplification, not an actual intelligible idea of how to tolerate others, is what leads to paradoxes. Because of course it compels you to find a place for literally all stances, including those that by their nature are intolerant of others. Now, how did we end up with this concept of tolerance? Well, first, it just feels kind of intuitive, right? If accepting different things makes you tolerant, then the more things we accept, the more tolerant we are. And once Christians latched onto and ran with this apparent truism, they managed to take it into intuitive but totally wrong territory before most people noticed. But there's a deeper and more fundamental problem at work here. On some level, this is a symptom of how the Christian understanding of morality, as well as how to interact with others in general, has been undermined by fundamentalist thinking. They see morals as being defined by pure dictate. Whatever God says goes. So everybody should obey biblical or church teaching because it's been decreed by people who, of course, speak for God. Even if many don't consciously put this limited level of thought into it, most Christians end up at the same place, which is with a deep-rooted feeling that their concept of morality is just the morality. It would rarely, if ever, enter their minds to fully consider the possibility that their code of morality is just one of many imperfect sets of rules arrived at by different groups of people. They don't grasp the place that Christian values have in the world because Christian values have always filled their world, often going back to childhood. And on top of that, much of American society has historically, at least by insinuation, treated their values as the norm. Thus, it's natural for them to think their rules are just the rules. Take a list that includes don't steal, obey your parents, go to church, don't kill, don't cheat on your spouse, and don't lie with a man as with a woman. They have an ingrained sense that good people follow these rules, and by contrast, people who openly decide not to follow these rules are just choosing to be bad, or at least to compromise themselves to some extent. So when society started saying that we should tolerate some of these actions, many Christians, including me at the time, saw this not only as a weird and sudden intrusion into the conversation, but as an erosion into what everybody should know to be good behavior. To become more tolerant of any of these behaviors is to knowingly allow for a more lax attitude toward morality, meaning tolerance is essentially permissiveness, an anything-goes attitude. And that's where we come to the crux of the problem. The idea that, since these rules are morality by definition, a challenge to any of them means that anything goes. Remember, these are usually the same people who tell us that nothing would be right or wrong without God, that He's the sole source of morality. And they see this list in that light. It's an all-or-nothing description of God's standard, so to tolerate one violates the foundation for them all, and indeed the foundation for saying that anything is right or wrong. Thus they view opposition to anything on this list as a declaration that rules and morality don't count, and they interpret tolerance as saying everything's acceptable. So if you get to violate the injunction against being gay of all things, then why shouldn't I be able to violate your injunction against opposing homosexuality? This is where fundamentalism has created a communication barrier between its adherents and anybody who intelligibly discusses morality. Non-fundamentalists don't believe moral rules are arrived at by dictate. And when we reject dictates, it's not because we reject authority or the idea of personal accountability. So we won't automatically reject the rule itself. What we'll reject is flat dictate as the basis for that rule, meaning we'll expect you to articulate why people should have to follow it in light of its impact on others and society. And as long as you keep thinking that one of these reactions has anything to do with the other, you'll continue to be baffled by why the secular world reacts to you the way it does. When we see this list of teachings, we're not just going to reject them all because we're anti-Christian or don't like authority. Nor are we going to ask people to tolerate all of them because everything goes. Rather, we're going to look at them and ask ourselves which are clearly necessary to help people live together in a safe, peaceful society. See, we do judge people's behavior, and broadly speaking, we do so based on two criteria. 1, it should not cause harm to others or disrupt society, and 2, it should respect the autonomy of those who aren't causing harm. So when we see don't steal and don't kill on this list, we accept them as good moral, even necessary legal principles. We can see don't cheat on your spouse as a valid teaching due to the emotional harm the act can cause others, but various points of nuance and issues of personal freedom make us stop short of considering it legally prohibitable. Obey your parents is a good general command for the sake of order and of children's safety, though there are exceptions, recognized by Christians as well as non-Christians, to be made in cases of abuse or horrible parental judgment, which really goes to show that even they recognize how to intelligently filter these commands on some level, even if they don't give enough conscious thought to it. The point is, to whatever extent we acknowledge that these principles have value, it's because we see how failing to follow them can cause harm or social disorder and thus violate the first principle. By contrast, going to church, while Christians consider it a marker of strong character and it kind of seems commanded by Hebrew 10's injunction not to forsake assembling together, does not seem to violate either of these two principles, so we should see not going to church as something you should tolerate. Thus, forcing everybody to go to church violates the second principle. And to varying degrees, we would frown upon, indeed you would say not tolerate, people putting undue social pressure on others to attend a church. If even the most ardent Christians pictured another religion, or even a different kind of church pressuring them this way, they would get what I'm talking about. Similarly, homosexuality does not violate either of these principles, and is only argued to by people who come up with questionable indirect reasons it's harmful after the fact. It does no direct, demonstrable harm to anybody, and thus we see it as tolerable. Thus, forcing people not to engage in homosexual relationships, or otherwise legally interfering with them, violates the second principle. And to varying degrees we would frown upon, indeed not tolerate, people putting undue social pressure on others to give up homosexuality. Tolerance, at least applied as a principle that helps us live together in a tenable society, is not just flat acceptance of everything. It needs guidelines, and it does set standards for human behavior. It appeals to an often unstated but deeply understood social contract that sets boundaries for what we should and shouldn't do to other people and what is or is not our business. It's not some amorphous principle of permissiveness that turns a blind eye to the nature of anything that can be packaged as a behavior, an opinion, or a lifestyle. So when Christians try to package "don't be homosexual" as just another behavior, opinion, or lifestyle, we're not going to automatically tolerate it because we're blindly permissive. We're going to unpack it, evaluate it, and see what its implications are, just as we did with homosexuality itself. Now, does this mean we'll compel people not to believe homosexuality is wrong? No. But we're not going to guard people from the natural social consequences of their opinions. We'll treat the belief with the same regard and give it the same place in conversation as all other apparently unjustified opinions. And insofar as you use social pressure to discourage homosexuality, we'll push back with pressure of our own. Whenever that pressure approaches the level of harassment, we'll respond appropriately. And when it's used as a basis for laws or allowance of discrimination, we will fight back legally, for the sole reason that we don't wield the law against anything that doesn't violate either of these principles. And for the sake of freedom, we stop those who try to do so. The fact that we respond like this does not make us intolerant, and it certainly doesn't make Christians victims. And it's time they stopped misusing the language of tolerance to pretend it does. This program was made possible by a grant from S.R. Foxley, Bob Generic, Nim Morris, Connor Emsley, Mike McBiles, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.